At this time, I would like to introduce you to our guest celebrity. JD Vance is an investor, a commentator, and author of the #1 New York Times bestselling Hillbilly, Elegy, described by the National Review as a brilliant book and by the Economist as one of the most important reads of 2016. Truly, I can tell you this book changed my life. Raised by his working-class grandparents in Middletown, Ohio, JD graduated high school in 2003, then immediately enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. He was deployed to Iraq in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom. When he finished his 4-year enlistment, JD moved back to Ohio and enrolled at The Ohio State University. After graduating, he studied at Yale Law School. During his time, he provided free legal counsel to veterans. JD earned his law degree in 2013. After a stint at a large corporate law firm, JD moved to San Francisco to work in the technology industry. He served as a principal at the leading Silicon Valley venture capital firm, Mithril Capital. JD continues to lecture and write on topics of public interest. In early 2017, he returned home to Ohio to found Our Ohio Renewal, a nonprofit organization dedicated to addressing the state's opioid crisis and bringing high-quality employment and educational opportunities to Ohioans. He regularly discusses politics and public policy on national networks and has appeared on ABC, CBS, and Fox News. He currently serves as a contributor on CNN. JD lives in Columbus, Ohio, with his wife and 2 dogs, and soon-to-be young little man, where he works on his nonprofit and investment activities. Please join me in welcoming JD Vance to the lectern.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Thank you to the Board of Trustees and to everybody here at Zane State College for welcoming me, for making me feel like such a welcome member of the community. I want to be one of the first to, first of all, wish you guys congratulations to the graduates of the class of 2017. Congratulations. So I remember not long after I graduated from high school in 2003 that I watched a commencement address by Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple. And in that commencement address, Steve Jobs advised people to do what they loved, to follow their passion, to make sure that whatever they did, whatever field of work that they were in, they should follow their passion and do what they loved. And I remember watching that and thinking that it didn't necessarily apply especially well to me, and that I wish somebody had given me different advice. Because if I think about what it is that I love, well, I love, for example, sitting around in my underwear eating ice cream, but I don't think anybody's going to pay me anything to do that, and certainly I maybe have tried, and trust me, they won't pay you for doing that. There are a lot of things I love. I love playing with my German Shepherd dog, but again, no one's going to really pay me to do that either. And so I had wished then that somebody had given me a different set of advice, had given me a different piece of advice, and that's what I'm going to give you folks here today. And that's not necessarily find what you love, though if you find something that you love and you can work in that field, then by all means follow that passion and follow that interest. But if it doesn't describe you, then do something else. Find a vocation. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is find something that you enjoy doing most of the time and that you're good at. Now, the story of how I found my vocation is pretty odd, because if you had looked at my life when I was 13 years old, you would have expected that I wouldn't have turned out especially well. I was struggling in a lot of different ways. I was starting to experiment with drugs. I was not doing especially well in school. And it was in early high school when my mother came to me and said that she needed a jar of my urine. And the reason she needed it is because she had to pass a state-mandated drug test the next day. Now, I didn't want to give her that jar of urine. I didn't want to help her out. I didn't want to enable her, but eventually I did. And I did in part because my mamaw, my grandmother, who had played such a positive role in my life, encouraged me to do so. And I couldn't turn mamaw down, because even before I moved in with mamaw, she was this incredibly positive influence on my life. She really was the savior in my life, the person who made it possible for me to live a decent and happy life. But the upside of that moment, as traumatic as it was to have to enable Mom like that, the really great thing about that moment is that Mamaw saw what effect it was having on me. She saw that I went to school teary-eyed and upset that day, and she realized that the way that I was living was starting to have real consequences for me. And so she said, JD, we're done with this moving around crap. We're done with you spending a few days here, a few days there. You're going to come in and you're going to live with me, and we're going to do things differently. Now, those who haven't read the book maybe don't appreciate what an incredible person my Mamaw was. She didn't necessarily fit the stereotype of a classic grandmother. She really loved to use the F word. And when she died, she had 19 loaded handguns in her house. And the reason that she had 19 is because she used a walker and didn't get around especially well. And so she had hidden them in various parts of her house so that if an intruder came in, no matter where she was, she had a loaded handgun within arm's reach. But Mamaw also provided the love and the discipline that I needed. You know, she found out, for example, that I was hanging out with a kid in town who was known to be doing drugs even at a young age, and she said, JD, you know what? If you keep hanging out with that kid, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm going to run him over with my car, and no one will ever find out. Now, of course, I don't think that Mamaw would have actually run over an innocent kid, but I thought she did at the time, and that was enough to set me straight. And there were a lot of moments like that, a lot of moments where Mamaw provided not just the love, but also the discipline I needed to live a happy life. And I know looking out across the audience, there are a lot of Mamaws and Papaws and moms and dad, aunts and uncles who've played similar roles in your lives. Now, the story of my life from there is that things went pretty well for me. I graduated from high school. My grades had gotten better by that point. I enlisted in the Marine Corps. I spent 4 years in the Marine Corps. And then, like you just heard, I went to Ohio State and on to Yale Law School. But every single step of the way, even though I did a lot of cool stuff and I did some things that I enjoyed, I never found a passion. I never did something that made me feel like I was never at work. And I think the truth is that I'm just not the sort of person that is ever going to feel like that. But what I did realize as I was going through my life in college and in the Marine Corps and law school is that there were things that I enjoyed doing, and there were things that I was pretty good at. I was decent at writing. And so eventually I started to focus a lot on writing, and of course that's worked out pretty well for me. I liked math, and I also liked working in businesses, but not any business. I really liked new businesses. I liked the challenge of what a startup company required, of raising that initial round of money so that you can hire people and bring people on, of finding that first customer and closing that first deal. And so I worked in venture capital, which is a sector of the investment community that focuses on early stage startups. Now, I love those things in the sense that I'm really happy what I'm doing, but I would never say that they were purely my passion. And I think that the thing that we should be mindful of, for those of you who are like me, who are always going to see a job as a job, even if it's a job that you like, is that you shouldn't put yourself under too much pressure. You shouldn't think that unless you wake up every single day and you are happy at your job, that somehow you're a failure. Because trust me, I think even Steve Jobs probably hated his job quite a bit. I think that what you should do is think about the things that you're good at. Find the skills you're good at and figure out a way to translate those skills into a job that pays a good wage and makes you happy and makes you feel like you're contributing meaningfully to your community. Now, I picked up a lot of advice. I picked up a lot of bits of wisdom that I'll share with you now on the way to finding my vocation. The first thing that I learned, and I learned it the hard way, is that failure happens to everybody. Failure doesn't mean that you're a bad person. Failure doesn't mean that the trajectory of your life is fundamentally negative and going down. It happens to everyone, and I have seen failure happen to every single person. Now, I remember just a few years ago, I was hired to be a policy staff person on a presidential campaign. Now, I was so excited. I had wanted to work in policy for my entire life, and working on public policy allowed me to work on some of the things that I really cared about. Again, it was a possible vocation for me. But after 2 days on that job, I was fired. And the reason I was fired is because the person who had hired me had discovered that I had written some things that were critical of the campaign that I was working for. Not anything especially egregious, not anything super negative, but they just didn't, understandably, they didn't want anybody who was out there having criticized their candidate, and so they let me go. Now, I remember walking home that day and feeling so terribly ashamed of myself, of thinking to myself, things will never work out, I will never be happy, things will never go in the right direction for me. And then 3 days later, I actually got an offer to go and work in the technology sector in Silicon Valley. So something that I had always wanted to do, something that I, in fact, was willing to put off for this presidential campaign, opened up right at the moment where I was at my lowest, where I thought that my entire life was going to be one of failure and of problems. That lesson in failure taught me, one, yes, that failure happens to everybody, but that two, how well you deal with failure is very often a function of how well you interact with the people in your community and in your family. Because I didn't want to tell my wife that I had gotten fired. I remember feeling ashamed. I didn't want to see the look in her eye when I told her that this thing that I was really excited about, that just 2 days earlier, I had walked in the door triumphantly holding my phone and saying, I got this job, and I had to go and tell my wife in almost the exact opposite way that I hadn't gotten that job, that in fact, it had been retracted. But when I told my wife that, expecting her to look at me like I was a failure or like I was a bad person, what she instead did was give me a hug and tell me that everything was going to work out. And it's important when you fail, not just to pick yourself back up, but to let the people in your life pick you up too. Another lesson that I learned is that it's important to never think the deck is stacked against you. Now, I grew up in a family with a lot of disadvantage. We did not have a lot of money. My family was completely ripped apart by the opioid epidemic. There were a lot of things that weren't easy for me. And my beloved Mamaw recognized that. She said, JD, things are unfair for people like us. Things are not as easy for people who grew up like us. Things are not as easy for poor people. But never be like those losers who think the deck is stacked against you, because you can do anything you want. Now, that is a hard and very real tension that exists, and something that a lot of you, I guarantee, are facing right now and will continue to face for the rest of your life. To recognize that things haven't been as easy for you, to recognize that life maybe has dealt you a crappy hand, but to still have the courage to play that hand as well as possible anyway. To recognize that no matter what barriers life placed in front of you, to take courage from those barriers, to recognize them, and to overcome them anyway. Now, that's not an easy line to walk. I think we too easily fall into the trap of saying there are no barriers for some of the people that have had a tough life, or that the barriers are completely overwhelming and can overcome you. But the successful people that I've seen, the people who have done well in life, the people who have led happy lives, have recognized that the disadvantage they face is important and real, but that it shouldn't defeat them all at the same time. And I encourage you to try to walk that balance and to appreciate that tension as much as you can. Another piece of advice is to appreciate that what makes a happy life isn't just a successful vocation, but it's everything else that exists in your life too. It's your family, it's your friendships, it's the friends that you've made here at Zane State, and it's the friends that you'll make throughout the entire course of your life. Now, I remember when I was going through law school, there was this sense that people had that their self-worth and their measurement was purely in their credentials and in their accomplishments. People were desperate to get that next great job. People were desperate to get that next item on their resume. They were desperate to have something that they could show to their friends and family that said, I made it. And I remember being so caught up in that rat race, being so obsessed with getting that next great job, that I applied for a job that I didn't even want in California. And eventually, it was a mentor. It was a law school professor who told me, JD, I don't think that this job is worthwhile. I don't think that this job is something that's going to help you in your career goals. I think you're going after this for all the wrong reasons. You're going after this because it's a fancy credential. And then she gave me the best piece of advice that I have ever been given by anyone. And it's, I think that you should decline that job, and I think you should focus on this girl that you recently started dating that I can tell that you're crazy about. Now, that was 6 years ago that she gave me that advice, and in 3 weeks, that girl that I decided to focus on is going to have our first baby. That's my wife. And being willing to sacrifice for family, being willing to focus on the things in life that really matter is too often seen in our society as a sign of weakness, too often seen as a bad decision. And I am here to tell you that it is in fact the best and most important decision that you will ever make, is to focus on your friends and to focus on your family, to make not just your vocation an important part of your life, but to make your friends and family a part of that life too. The very last piece of advice that I want to give you folks is, and I'm mindful that I am here in Zanesville, which is so much like Middletown, Ohio, where I grew up, and that's to remember where you came from. Now, it will be easy for you to look at where you came from and to criticize it. And I certainly look sometimes back at Middletown and think to myself, man, the Middletown I grew up in was kind of a crap hole. It was easy for me to be a little bit ashamed of where I came from, because I found when I went to places like Ohio State and Yale that some people even looked down maybe on the places that I came from and thought less of me because I didn't come from a certain city, because I didn't come from a certain high school. But one of the most important things I've realized in my life is that there were incredible amounts of love and courage and resilience and wisdom in the people in the place that I came from, and I guarantee that's true for each and every one of you. So don't forget that. Now, I've had, like I said, a sort of an odd life. I have very complex feelings about my mom, who became addicted to prescription opioids, and she's doing well now. But it was hard for me to accept that just because somebody had wronged me, just because somebody had maybe made a bad decision, that they weren't entirely a bad person. And that even though there were negative things about my community and about my neighborhood and about my culture, there were incredibly powerful and important and good things to come from those places. Draw strength from those good things. You're going to have bad people in your life. You're going to have bad people in your family. You're going to have complicated relationships with nearly everyone. But if you go through life recognizing that people are complex, that you can take the good even as you accept the bad, that there is real strength in this community that made you, that supported you, and that loves you, you will always stay rooted, you will always stay grounded, and importantly, you will always stay humbled. And that's an incredibly important part of living a happy life. Now, part of remembering where you came from is to honor your loved ones and to honor the people that made you who you are. One of the lessons of my life, and certainly one of the theses of my book, is that for kids who grow up in the circumstances that I grew up in, a lot of things had to go right. And a lot of things really had to go right for me. I had to have a mamaw who, even though she couldn't afford the co-pays on her prescription drugs, made sure that I had school supplies so that I could do well in school. I had a sister who, despite being only 6 years older than me, made sure that she called my mamaw and papaw when things got too chaotic in my home so that we could get the help that we need. I had an aunt and an uncle who provided me a home after mamaw died and no one was able to provide me a place to live. I had teachers and mentors. I had friends who helped me along the way. I even now encounter people who are nice to me, not because they have to be or because they should be, but because it's the right thing to do. And so part of honoring all of these people who sit here behind you is not just to thank them and not just to love them, but to pay it forward. To treat the people in your life the same way that they treated you. To find a kid to mentor who really needs it, even though he's not necessarily your responsibility. That is the most important way to honor the people behind you, because they have given and given, and they don't want much in return. They maybe just want a little respect, a thank you every now and then, and a recognition that the people that they've invested so much in are going to live happy lives where those people can pay it forward and where you can play the same role in a lot of the people's lives that you care about that they played in your life. The very last piece of advice that I'll give you is that you should feel good about today and about the recent years that have led to today's accomplishments. This is, of course, not just about today. This is the shining jewel in the crown of many years, in some cases, at least a couple of years for nearly all of you. Years of hard work, of study, of late nights, of time spent away from work and family. You should feel good about today. You should honor the people who helped you get here. You should thank them. You should celebrate them. But I ask you to also recognize that you should pat yourselves on the back a little bit today. Celebrate today, respect what you've done, and tomorrow recognize that the next chapter begins, and I hope you all have the same success in that next chapter as you've had in this one. I will be rooting for you, and I wish you the best of luck. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Vance. That was inspirational, truly special, and I'd love sometime over dinner to trade grandma stories. Everyone at the college appreciates you participating in this day, and let me tell you, this entire community thanks you for helping us tell our story.